Okay. Well, I do want to welcome everybody. I'm sorry we had a few little technical issues here at the start, but hopefully it will work. I always tell people that technology is a wonderful thing when it works. Sorry about that. Okay. I hope you can all see the screen, and Rensky, please let me know if anyone cannot see the screen or if you cannot see it. If any of you have any questions, whether it be technical for Rensky or for me, please use the chat at the chat box on your screen, and we'll answer some questions during this webinar, and the remaining questions we will answer during the Q&A at the end. And I will stay late if I need to answer all questions that need to be answered. So good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to the seminar, Benchmarking for Facilities Professionals. And today what we're going to do is explore what benchmarking can mean to facility managers and what can make an implementation successful. We're also going to look at some of the traps that facility managers can fall into. Benchmarking has become one of those industry buzzwords. Everybody seems to want benchmarking data, although everyone has a different definition of what that means. But they do like to know something about how they compare to other folks that are out there managing buildings. So we're going to look at that. It means different things to different people. And we've discovered that what one organization is trying to do with benchmarking will not always be the same as with another. So we're going to try to add a little light to all the choices and decisions you can make related to benchmarking to be sure you are successful in your efforts. We're going to have a lot of real-world examples with real data during this presentation and some tips to help you on your way. We're also going to, as I mentioned, have time for Q&A at the end, and do use that chat box. And Rensky will interrupt me at times and answer questions. So what you're going to learn today are three basic objectives. One is I'm going to identify what I think are 5 critical components to a successful implementation. We're going to see what the pitfalls are to successful benchmarking, and we're going to see how to go from just comparing building data, which was where most people like to start, to really going to the other extreme to improving your building performance as a result. So to do that, you've got to get into some KPIs and other things. We'll be addressing some of that. For those of you who like to see who your speaker is, this is what I looked like probably a few years ago. And my recent background is I am a principal of FM benchmarking. I don't know if you're familiar with the online magazine FM Link, but if you are, I am the publisher of that, and I do run both companies right now. Prior to that, I spent a long time as an in-house facility manager, both in the private sector and in the public sector, working for the GSA of the U.S. government in the public sector. I then ran a consulting firm for many years, helping folks automate their facilities operations using a lot of what used to be known as the CAFM systems, later becoming, of course, the IWMS. The last bullet here talks about the benchmarking book that I wrote, the e-book, which I will provide a link to it at the end of this presentation, and if you get the PowerPoint slides, which will be sent to you by Rensky if you want them, of this presentation, so you'll see that link there as well. Today's agenda. So we're going to first see what we have to do to all get on the same page, at least for the duration of this presentation. Then we're going to look at the key components of successful benchmarking, those 5 critical areas. Then lots of examples of those, especially showing the value of filters to generate meaningful comparisons. and that's a key part of benchmarking. So we see a lot of examples there. We'll then identify some of the potential pitfalls, and we will see then how we can use best practices to take you from just comparing buildings to actually improving them. More examples with the best practices, again with real data. And then I'll show you what people have actually saved by benchmarking, actual savings experienced in their buildings. And then I'll give you a 30-second infomercial about FM benchmarking, just so you know what that is and what my background is as it relates to benchmarking. And then we'll have Q&A at the end. So our first part is getting started with benchmarking. We'll start, of course, with a definition, nice and simple. The use of a standard by which a metric can be measured or judged. And I think one of the best ways to describe this is to clear up one source of confusion that we see with a lot of folks, which is a lot of folks see that the words benchmarking and indexing are very similar or even interchangeable. They are not. An index is a statistical tool designed to measure performance over time. So if we're talking about buildings, that an index could mean that buildings this year cost 10% more to operate than they did a year ago. That would be an index. For those who follow investments or stock markets, there are indexes that show you that the index this year is higher or lower than it was last year. Those are indexes. A benchmark is something that serves as a standard by which others are judged or measured. So it's a point of reference from which other measurements may be made. So in the facilities world, my building may be costing 10% less to operate than the norm. That would be a benchmark. Who is benchmarking really for? And this is the audience, and I know we have a lot of you out there, and some of you are wearing multiple hats representing facility managers and associations or FM groups. A lot of times benchmarking is done by contractors who are outsourced contractors doing work back for facility managers, their clients. Sometimes there are consultants out there. And those of you in the university arena, benchmarking is used to do research, or can be. And benchmarking is now taught in a lot of the schools. So there's lots of potential folks out there, and they all have the same common needs and common elements, but where you go with that is going to vary depending on the group. The next two slides will show you the benefits for the two largest groups. So what can benchmarking really do for me? And these can later turn into the objectives of a benchmarking program. So the first item, I can look up a metric related to my building, and that's where a lot of folks really start with benchmarking. They just want to look something up and see where they stand, and then that leads to the second item on here, which is comparing my building to other buildings. So that's where most folks are. I put those two in boldface because that's as far as many people go with benchmarking. But there's a lot of other things that you can do. You can improve your building performance. I will show you how to do that later. You can justify your budget. So you can go to your superiors in your organization and justify a need to have a higher budget for next year, so you can implement some KPIs. You can justify similarly your staff requirements. So that also becomes a big one. And know where to increase or decrease your outsourcing efforts. That's if you're a facility manager. Now, if you are an outside contractor, you've got some additional things that you can do with benchmarking. First of all, this is a big one. If you have benchmarked your clients and you find that they are doing better than others, in other words, you're spending less money per square meter, than others that are outside of your company, then you have a justification to go out there and have marketing materials and show that to potential clients and win more work. So that is one very big thing. If there are areas where some of your clients may be below your norm, you can show your clients what to do through KPIs and how to improve, and you'll see how benchmarking ties into that. Third, you can justify your pricing to clients because you can tell a client, look, we are charging less than others that are running their buildings comparably, or we're charging the same, or whatever. And of course, if you're demonstrating that your clients are doing better, you've got a good sales tool. So that's what benchmarking can do for you. Now, let's move on to the next part of our agenda, which is where we're going to look at what the key components are of successful benchmarking. And don't forget to send any questions you have to Rensky through the chat box as we go along. 5 critical components to successful benchmarking. Okay, the first one is you got to have the right benchmarking tool. For some, it may be looking up some numbers in a chart or a table, but nowadays there are many tools that are automated, and the question is, how do you find the right one? And that's what people spend a lot of effort on, and they think, okay, now that we have the right tool, we can benchmark. Well, that is absolutely false, because you will not have a successful benchmarking venture if that's all you do is have the right tool. So what else do you need? The second item that you need is you need to have a database within that tool with enough buildings in it. If you have a database with 100 buildings, you're not going to be able to benchmark much. And just to give you an idea of how big a database you need, you don't need to be thinking in terms of hundreds, but rather thousands of buildings in your database. And if I were to turn on what I call 4 filters, such as an example of a filter might be large buildings, another might be buildings in my climate zone, another might be buildings that are open 24/7. These are all filters. We use over 50 such filters. If I turn on just 4 filters, to end up with a report that has 25 or so buildings in it, which is what we think the minimum is to get meaningful results, comparison data, you would need to have roughly 2,000 buildings in your initial database just to end up with 25 by turning on 4 filters. If you were to turn on a 5th filter, you would need to double the 2,000 and have 4,000 buildings in your original database. So you really need to get as many buildings as you can in the database. Now, are you done? Is that all you need? No. We need to have something else. And obviously the heading on the slide says you need to have 5, so we know there's going to be 3 more. You need to know what to do with all that information. Benchmarking is more than just a science where you look up a number. It is an art as well. So it's an art and a science, and you need to have some expertise. You need to be able to play with numbers and say, let's see what happens if I turn on a filter, turn off a filter, and I will be showing you examples of how important that is. So knowledge is important, and you need to have a consultant if you don't know how to get that yourself. But the ebook will have a lot of information about how to do that. Even if you had all those first 3 things, if you don't implement any of the suggested KPIs or best practices, you're not going to improve, and all your efforts are for naught. So you do need to implement the recommendations. And are you done there? The answer is no. You still need to do this annually. Benchmarking is an annual exercise. It's an ongoing, continuous improvement exercise. And we have data that proves that every year someone benchmarks, they will actually continue to improve. It's not just a one and done kind of thing. So you'll see proof of that in some of the charts I show you later. So what is the right benchmarking tool? We look at 4 key parts. There's really more than that, but these are the most important. You need to have the right metrics covered in the tool. Usually metrics are going to be a variety of costs. These are cost data. These are going to be often in the area of utilities. They're going to be in the area of maintenance, janitorial, security, sometimes landscaping or grounds, sometimes waste management. But the first 4 that I gave you, well, the first 2 I gave you are the 2 largest in terms of operating expenses. They're going to be your utilities and your maintenance, and together they occupy, our data shows, about 2/3 of the operating expenses of a building. Next, at about half of each of the other 2 comes the janitorial, and next comes security. Those first 4 will comprise roughly 95% of a building's operating expenses. Another big metric is what we in the States call utilization rate, which is really the number of square meters per person that a building occupies. So we call it a space utilization rate. That's a very important metric to look at. So, but other metrics that are unrelated to cost would be the number of employees that you're housing, the number of facilities workers that it takes to get the job done, and there's a whole bunch of other metrics that one can have. The second area are filters. Examples of filters, I mentioned a few a moment ago, would be climate, hours of occupancy of the building, how old the building is, lots of things, how what percentage of a building is occupied by a data center, because data centers take a lot more cost to run than other areas of your building. So these filters are important, and they help you compare your building to others accurately, so you're comparing apples to apples. Reports. You need to have the reports like utility cost per square meter, maintenance cost per square meter, energy consumption per square meter, area cleaned per worker, area occupied per person. All these are reports. And you need a system that is easy to use. Back when I was doing my CAFM consulting, I used to evaluate systems, and one of the evaluation factors was ease of use. And I defined it back then in the early 1980s as 3 key areas of ease of use. And believe it or not, that has not changed. It works today with every system that is out there. So the first of those 3 areas for ease of use is how obvious is the system. So you look at it and you know that if you want to go from here to there, you know exactly what to click on to do that. So ease of use, number 1, is obviousness. Second, even if I know what to do, if I'm doing it a lot, I don't want to have to go to 4 or 5 screens to do it. I want to be able to just jump right to that screen with a minimal number of keystrokes or clicks. And third, even with all that, I want to have a very rapid response time. So when I click, I want the next screen to pop up immediately. Now, all the above on this slide will vary depending on the industry you're benchmarking. So office buildings are the most generic, but if you have a manufacturing facility, some of your metrics and filters and reports will change. Same thing with hospitals, with banks, and so on. In a hospital, you'll be counting discharge rates, hotels, the number of beds. There's all kinds of things that one can use as metrics. Some folks in the retail industry use the length of all the counters in the retail facilities as a measure. So industries can change what the metrics are. I'm going to now go into showing you the examples with filters. And you'll see the value of filters. These next two slides are going to be looking at utility costs. And these slides are done in feet, not meters, because I just did a presentation. I wanted to use these slides for that. And they're in US dollars, but of course they work for any kind of denomination. The FM benchmarking tool does convert from one to another very or seamlessly. So, and a good tool is going to do that. So let's explain what this chart is, and then we can go into what it means. So each vertical line on this chart represents a different building in the database. But it's not the entire database, it's just the part of the database that is relating to the filters selected. Here you see at the bottom only one filter was selected, 600,000 gross square feet. So it's about 60,000 meters. That is a large building. So we're looking only at buildings in the database that are large. That's all you see here. And there's probably 200 or 300 on this chart. Now, the yellow building, this vertical line here where I'm pointing, is our building. That's the subject building. So we can see that our building is actually spending more than most buildings in the database. The red line is your median. It is always on the border of the second and third quartiles. So we're in the third quartile halfway through. We're spending about $3.30 or so per square foot on this chart. Okay, I'm now going to go to another slide. I'm going to add a filter to this, and the filter I'm adding is going to be older buildings, 21 to 50 years, because our building is old. Well, we still are spending $3.30 a square foot. That hasn't changed, of course. However, look where we are now. We're now on the border between the second and third quartile because we're using more appropriate filters. And by doing that, what do we see? We see that a lot of the buildings that are newer, which are probably spending less on utilities because they're more efficient, have dropped off of this chart. We have fewer buildings overall on the chart, and that's why it looks like we move to the left. So you need to play with filters to be sure you're using the right ones. Now, a lot of people look at energy cost, but there's also energy consumption, and they're different. The next slide shows what happens when I look at energy consumption. Here I'm looking at just with two filters. We're looking at office buildings only, and changing the building is changing any filter is going to change these charts. And I'm looking at buildings that are in a hot, dry climate. Okay, so here we see our building is into the second quartile. Anything to the left of the median is considered good. Okay, the more to the left you are, the better it is. So you can see how filters can change the representation of the data. Now let's look at two slides on maintenance. Here we have a lot of buildings. It's back to the original set of 600,000 gross square feet or more. And here you can barely see a yellow line. We're in the fourth quartile. Most buildings are doing better than we are. We have a very nice smooth curve, except right here at the end, there's, at the beginning I should say, there are some buildings that are spending a lot less, and there are a few at the very end. But those don't impact the way we look at this chart because we're not looking at averages, we're looking at means. And we're looking at where the quartile breaks are, which would be exactly the same with or without those buildings on the far left or far right. That's why medians are very important to work with. Okay, our building's in the fourth quartile that we see right here. Now let's add the age factor. Once again, our building performance just moved into the third quartile. It's costing the same to maintain, but we've gotten rid of some of the newer buildings from our filter set, and that makes this chart more meaningful to us. That's why filters are important. Here's a chart that looks like it's backwards, but it's not. We're not looking at costs. We're looking at how much area got cleaned by the average janitorial worker over a year. Okay, so here it's best to be on the left side of this chart, as all charts, but the higher numbers are going to be on the left. So here we are in the first quartile. What's interesting here are the two middle quartiles are pretty flat, the second and third, and that's pretty typical for area studies. Here we're looking at office buildings, by the way, that are working at 8 to 16 shifts per week, so it's not quite 24/7. And we see a big variation in the first quartile that's not atypical for janitorial work, and a lot of that does depend on what kind of building you have, how open the spaces are, and so on. And then we have a big drop-off here in the fourth quartile. By using other filters, you can begin to figure out how to get rid of some of those steep drop-causing buildings. If we look at the utilization rate, gross area per occupant, again, a pretty smooth curve, except at the very end, there may be some buildings with some very special needs space, bidding rooms, conference rooms, big waiting rooms, perhaps for a custom and immigration at the airport or something like that. They probably should be filtered out from this report, but I wanted to show you what happens if they're not. So again, these are kinds of benchmarking reports that one can generate. Now I want to move into the next part of the presentation. It's a good time for me to remind you to please send any questions you have in on the chat box, and I'll answer some during the presentation and some at the end.
I have a nice question actually, Peter, about the filters and the metrics we just saw. Theo van der Voort is just asking, like, benchmarking could be seen as comparison with standards, but you focus more on comparison with other buildings with similar characteristics by using the filters. Which database can you use to compare the buildings, and who owns it, and how accessible is it?
Okay, let me make sure I understand the question. Is the question what standards do we use, or like for measuring the square meters, or is it more like just rephrase just so I'm sure I'm understanding the right question.
Which database can you use to compare a building with other buildings, and who in that case owns the data? Who is the owner of the data, and how accessible can it be for others?
Okay, the database is what the way it works with FM benchmarking, and it's going to be different with different systems, but with most systems out there, people will submit their data into a database. Sometimes it's done through a computer. Sometimes people fill out a chart and send it in. There are less people doing that these days, and then other people input the data, but somehow it gets into a database. It does not come, you can't just download it from some public database. It's not going to be sufficient, and those don't exist. So people need to input that data. In terms of use of standards, the biggest variation is how one measures a building. There are different standards all around the world for measuring, and IPD is used a lot in Europe. In the States, it's very confusing because there are 7 or 8 commonly used ways to measure buildings. They're not compatible. They're not convertible from one to another, and there could be as much variation as 15 or 20% in the area measurements of a building. we tend to use gross area instead of the net area. We find the results are more accurate and there's less variation. But still you need to be using the same method of measurement of square feet or square meters than as others using the database. We actually have a filter that enables people to select which method of measurement they are using to make sure that they can compare accurately, because we found that most people do not go and remeasure their building. Now, the other part of your question is what happens to this data once it is in the database? Who owns it? Nobody really owns it, but the data is really part of the database of the organization that has collected the data. So technically, that organization owns the data. Of course, the clients can pull their data out at any time, but nobody in a good benchmarking tool has access to the names of anybody else's data. You don't know that who any of the other participants are. You just know generically, as you saw on those charts I showed you, that they belong to somebody, but you don't know who they belong to.
Okay, thank you. There's also a follow-up question, like how do you select the most appropriate metrics?
That is a good question. We have found that, and I'm going to be showing you this a little bit later actually, but you can get 80% of the value out of a benchmarking tool with just inputting 20% of the data that you can input. To us, the most important data to put in would be your total costs for those 4 key areas I mentioned before: your utilities, your maintenance, your janitorial, and your security costs. Putting in the number of occupants in a building, this would be primarily for office buildings, but for other buildings it could be the number of beds or what have you, and putting in the number of square meters or square feet, your area data for your building. Those key numbers right there. There's another one too. For janitorial, we like to put in the number of amount of area to be cleaned, which is always different than the area in a building. And usually that will be in your janitorial contract, and we just pull a number right from that contract. Those are the key numbers. You're going to get a ton of value from that. Now, if you find, for example, that your maintenance costs are a lot more than average, then you're going to want to look at maintenance in more detail, break it out by crafts, like electricians versus carpenters versus plumbers and so on. But initially, just look at those totals. You're going to get a lot of the value out of a system. And we have clients that will keep adding data during the year as they want to look at more and more depth at what's going on. Benchmarking is not a one-time thing where you do it this month because it's the end of the year and then you're finished for another year. It's an ongoing process, and different things happen during the year where you're going to want to go look at the data in more depth and go into more detail. So initially it's just a little bit you need to put in, and then gradually you may want to put in more.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for now?
No.
Okay, let's look at some of the pitfalls. We have 2 basic types of pitfalls. These first ones are kind of fun because a lot of people are thinking about benchmarking, but they just don't get started. And why is that? So let's look at 3 reasons here. The first one is people are looking for the perfect tool. I will tell you, it never exists. It does not exist. It never will, because there's always ways to improve things. We have a laundry list of things we want to do to our tool to make it better and better, and we had a laundry list a year ago, a year before that. There's always going to be one, and there's no perfect tool. Second, And this is very, very important because one of the first questions we get asked a lot is, how many buildings do you already have in my city or my country? And one of the most difficult jobs I have is to tell people that's not the question that they should be asking. Now, I showed you before how you need to have a lot of buildings in the database, thousands of them. If we limit it by buildings in my city or country when I don't have to, then I'm reducing my database needlessly. So how do I get around that? And it's by benchmarking smartly. So we will provide a workaround, and these things exist. As an example, if I'm studying energy consumption, I can compare it to buildings in my own city. Of course, that's going to be a very valid comparison. But how can I expand that number? And the answer is by comparing my building to other buildings, not in my city, but to other buildings with the same climate zone anywhere in the world. I'm going to get a much larger set of data that way. Okay, now that has nothing to do if I'm looking at janitorial work, but so when I look at janitorial costs, I want to compare my building to those of other buildings who have the same janitorial rates. So if I'm paying so many euros an hour to janitorial staff, then I can compare myself to others who are paying the same amount and see how much work they're getting done. And then I've got a lot more buildings in my filter set. I can do that with anything I'm studying, whether it be maintenance, janitorial security, landscaping, and so on. So that way I've expanded my database, and it doesn't really matter how many buildings are in a given country or city. That would be nice to do, but it's more important to have more buildings in your comparison set and be able to use other filters that are going to give you more accurate and meaningful results. The third area here is trying to do too much on day one, and this ties into the question that was asked just a moment ago. Again, you can get 80% of the benefit by inputting 20% of the data, as I described before. So you don't have to do too much on day one. Just get started. Start getting data out of the system and get some good conclusions. Okay, the other type of pitfall is once people have started, what mistakes do they most commonly make? The first one is jumping to premature conclusions. They're basing their recommendations on not enough buildings or on buildings with inappropriate filters or old data. There are a lot of systems out there that are using data that's from 3 years ago or older. And you need to know the age of the data, and for obvious reasons, if it's 3 years old, it's not going to be very valid. And not enough buildings, I've seen reports where people draw a conclusion, and I was interested in one conclusion once about something. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but I contacted the author of the report that was written, and I said, how many buildings were in your study where you had such and such a percent were saving more energy by doing this? And they said, well, this was all about there were a total of 700 buildings that were studied. I said, yeah, but how many were research laboratories, which is what this was about? And they said, well, there were 20 of them that were in research. And I said, and how many of those were laboratories? And they said 2. They drew a conclusion on 2 buildings. And presumably that went to somebody who approved or disapproved of some course of action for the building as a result. So be very careful on jumping to premature conclusions. A second is missing out on one of the critical components, the 5 components that I gave you before. So it could be using the wrong tool. It could be there are not enough buildings in the database. It could be someone didn't know how to interpret the data. It could be that you didn't implement any of the findings, and nobody implements everything that's recommended out of these systems. It's not practical, or it may not be feasible, but they implement some things. And of course, looking at benchmarking as a one and done event. It needs to be going on throughout the year. So those are the mistakes that people make once they've started benchmarking. Okay, let's look at some of the best practices. And the way I'm going to do that is we've been talking about comparing data. Okay, but we can take benchmarking to another level. Okay, and by doing that, we will improve building performance. So let's see how to do that. This is a schematic, a nicer drawing of the ones you've seen. So you know how to read this chart. Each vertical line's a different building and so on. Okay, so we have our building here. We're in the third quartile, which means there's a lot of room for improvement. But this chart does not tell us what we have to do to improve. So to improve, what we have to do is find out which KPIs, or what we call them as best practices, are being done by these buildings over here to the left that we are not doing in our building. So we benchmark at a second level. That's how you find out how to improve your building's results. So you're going to apply best practices to reduce your costs and improve the building performance because the data is already in the system. It makes it easy to do that. So schematically, what does that mean? And here we're showing 4 best practices on the left column. We're not following them in our building. And here we see what the better performing buildings are doing, perhaps in the second quartile. And then on the right side, we see what the best performing buildings are doing. Usually these numbers in the right column will be higher than in the third column. So we can look for where there are big differences from the second column, this third column to the fourth column, and that might be a big thing to improve. We can also look and see what most folks are doing. 88% are doing ongoing recommissioning. That might be something we want to do. So there are lots of ways to look at this data, and then one has to find out what the cost would be to implement some of these and decide whether it would be worth it or not. So this is the concept of how you use best practices to improve your performance. Now I'm going to show that in some real examples. I wanted to show that schematic because it's easier to read, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail in this one due to time constraints, but I will explain what to do in this. So this is a portion of the utility best practices that are in our system, and here we're looking at the best practices that we're not doing. That's where there's a no over here. And we were in the third quartile, if you may recall, and we're looking at just the top chart right now where we had that filter of large buildings. And we find out, if we look at these top 3 lines, we see on all these that there is a nice jump up in the first 2, but here there is actually a decrease. So what does that mean? When less or fewer people in the second quartile have implemented a best practice than in the third quartile. What it really means is that for this filter set, that is not a significant KPI. Okay, but it is significant up above. We think a difference of 10% or higher is significant. Okay, why did I circle those 3? It's because there's a big difference here. Then if I add a filter for age, you can see that the numbers went up considerably in all 3 of those lines. So just by adding an age filter, the KPIs are different. Someone had written in before the webinar about which are the most popular or predominant KPIs. It varies completely depending on the filters that are selected. It really, really does. And this example just demonstrates that. I could go into analyzing these other ones down below, but due to time, I don't want to do that right now. So, but think about how important the filters are, because they make or break the use of the system. Very similar chart for maintenance. And it works the same way. Here we see that the use of handhelds has got a pretty good score. Over here in our large buildings, but if we look at what happened here, in older buildings, the people in the worst performing quartile, the fourth quartile, are not using handhelds that much. But to get into the third quartile, they figure out a way to use it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And we could look at all these and come up with ways to analyze and see what the results are. But you can see you don't just benchmark and then figure out what to do with someone pointing you in a given direction. You really need to think about the results that are there and know how to interpret them. Okay, let's look quickly at some of the expected savings from benchmarking. And this chart shows results from our clients who have been benchmarking from anywhere from 1 to 10 years. And these are the results from the median company who's been benchmarking for that length of time, the median performing company in our database. So after 1 year, the median company was able to reduce its operating expenses by 6%. That's what this dark green bar means. In the second year, they were able to reduce by an additional 5%. That's the dark green over here. So if we add that to the 6% from the first year, we have the 11% represented by the light green bar. We see that there are additional savings each and every year one benchmarks. And of course, your bigger savings are going to be a bigger additional savings will be in the first years. But each year you're going up as far as the cumulative savings go that you are getting. So by the end of 10 years, the median company in the database has reduced its operating expenses by 31%. That is a lot of savings. That's very, very significant. And half the companies in the database have done even better. They did not implement every KPI. They implemented the ones that they felt they could justify. So that's real world that we're looking at. Similar kind of chart for energy savings. Again, more energy consumption saved for each year, actually, yeah, this consumption. And then of course, the cumulative savings was up to 40% after 10 years. So I did have a bonus item, which I am sadly to say I'm not going to show you due to time constraints, but you will get, if you ask for it, this PowerPoint presentation, which does show those slides, and you will see 10 tips to help you get the most out of benchmarking, and they're self-explanatory. So let's move on here, because I want to save time for some Q&A at the end. I want to have about 10 minutes. Just tell you a drop about FM benchmarking itself. You've seen a little bit of it as we went, but we enable you to benchmark with our query edition, where you have no data to input. You don't see a yellow line for your building, but you just see data. Or the two other editions have any amount of data you want to input, whatever you want. There's very little required data, and you get reports like what you saw. So that's what we're about. There's a lot of information on the front end of the website. There are reports that are accessible, benefits, savings, some of the charts that you just saw. It's a great learning experience, so go look at it even if you're not interested in any kind of benchmarking tool per se. And if you are interested in that ebook that we talked about, Benchmarking for Facility Professionals, you can get that off the IFMA Foundation website, because this was done at their request. And you go to foundation.ifma.org, then click on Research, and then click on Free White Papers, or you can get it from the FM Benchmarking website, and then go to the website and then click on Learning and then click on Articles. Either way, you get to that paper. So that is it for the formal part of the presentation. I now want to be able to answer any other questions that people may have.
Thank you so much, Peter. I do have a question. Professor Thier from the Ford mentioned that it was a very clear presentation, so many thanks for that. And he has one more question. The focus seemed to be on the cost saving and less on benefits like customer satisfaction, productivity, or health. Is it possible to benchmark on these criteria as well?
I'm sorry, what are the other criteria?
Criteria like productivity, customer satisfaction, the image of a company, healthcare, those kind of things. Because in the presentation you mentioned mostly cost savings. So
yes, well, cost is what seems to drive most facility managers, and the main way to get things approved is through cost. Productivity and customer satisfaction are two areas that we have looked into extensively, and there is such variety in the industry as to what those mean and how they can be measured. And we need to be able to get our hands wrapped around those in order to measure them. Yes, they can be benchmarked if there were a consistent way to measure them. And we're getting close. We're trying to do some things, but we're not quite satisfied yet with what it is that the metrics are. And even if we found them for one organization, they're going to be different for another organization. And it's obviously not simple, because those are topics that are very popular when you go to attend a conference, and I've yet to hear any really get any good clarity as to how to go about doing that. But I'd be happy to speak with the professor, offline on that, and maybe see if we can come up with something.
yeah, he already mentioned that he would love to talk to you again as well. I'm pretty sure that you have a lot of topics to talk about, because actually he is currently working on a model to standardize the measuring these kind of data as well. So I will make sure that you get into contact with him.
Thank you.
Let's see. So far, I don't have any further questions. So I'll invite people one more time to use the chat on the right side of your GoToMeeting pop-up to ask questions. No, I think it was all clear. And thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. I really like, especially the changes after implementing a specific best practice is very inspiring and very interesting to see. Thank you also to the attendees. I will send you all an email afterwards with a link to this presentation so that you can watch it again or share it with friends or colleagues. And I will also make sure that in the email you will find the link to the ebook that Peter just mentioned. So thank you all. And Peter and Theo, I will make sure that you can get into contact. Do you still have time now for further discussion, Peter?
Yeah, I've got about a half hour.
Okay. Then I will stop the recording, but then you can continue with the discussion if you want.
Excellent.
Thank you.